First, let's meet a young Egyptian who believed that Arabic culture was losing touch with its Islamic values. Hassan al-Banna.
He was a very humble teacher in a very small town in Egypt, and he decided to really do something about the cultural decline that basically had taken hold of Egypt and the Arab world by reminding Egyptians that they were inheritors of great religion and great culture.
And so in 1928, with a handful of like minds, he set up something called the Muslim Brotherhood. Fawaz Girgiz.
He decided to recruit some of his colleagues and friends and teachers in order to reform Egyptian society and in order to begin the process of al-Nahda, Renaissance, Islamic Renaissance.
So here's the intriguing thing about al-Banna. He saw his people in cultural decline, and yet there was an important aspect of al-Nahda, the Arab cultural renaissance, which he embraced. Remember the Imam who went to Paris, Sheikh Tahtawi? Well, Tahtawi influenced scores of Islamic thinkers, such as Muhammad Abdu, who repeatedly pressed for an educational system based on reasoning rather than rejection. And it was from this reformist tradition that al-Banna's uncompromising ideas emerged.
He was connected to what was known at that time as people who were the center of al-Nahda, the Renaissance, like Muhammad Abdu. So he was coming from this reformist trend.
The Muslim thinker Tariq Ramadan is al-Banna's grandson. Although he's not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and is often critical of the movement, he agreed to give me his perspective on his grandfather.
And in fact, when he was talking about politics, he took from Muhammad Abdu about the fact that he was saying that we can take from the British system, the parliamentary system, because this is not against the Islamic principles. So he was not at all coming from a literalist understanding. It was not about the Western thoughts. It was not about the Western achievements. All the contrary. He is quoting Descartes. He is quoting thinkers from the West. And he was saying that these are bright and sound ideas that we can take. There were 2 points of contention. The first one, of course, was colonization. The second was, of course, the cultural colonization, because Hassan al-Banna translated into practical terms something which is resisting cultural colonization. And of course, from where he was, this was based on coming back to religious principles, and the religious tradition would be the best way to resist Western colonization. Now, he's working and talking and thinking from within a civilization and a religious reference, and in that way he was also thinking that the best for Muslim majority countries is to build and set an Islamic state, but as a final achievement after having changed the society and changed the cultural reference.
In the 1930s and 40s, as Arab liberalism descended into crisis, al-Banna's tiny group grew rapidly. But it was soon clear that he had sharply stepped back from al-Tahtawi's and Abdu's embrace of Western culture. By the late 1940s, the Muslim Brotherhood was a political force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, as the Brotherhood was beginning in Egypt, a young Christian Orthodox Syrian was formulating his rejection of the Arab liberal experiment. But where al-Banna drew upon the idea of the Islamic nation, the Ummah, Michel Aflaq turned to the dream of Arabic unity.
The history of class structure in Egypt can be traced back to early pre-colonialism. From the age of kings, the structure started with the hierarchy, from the generals to the military and lawmakers, down to the workers and manual laborers. This construct was used for centuries to solidify a simple method to keep power from the hands of the many. It designed Egypt's society up until the present day with few modifications. Egyptian society is wrought with class warfare in this vast and illustrious history that can be traced back during the 19th century under Muhammad Ali Pasha al-Masud ibn Aga, the king of Egypt and the Sudan and parts of Saudi Arabia and also the entire Levant. Muhammad Ali was also considered the primary founder of modern-day Egypt, and from 1805 to 1848, his reign ruled throughout, and many had called him a pragmatist. Ali had a vision for Egypt. It was to leave the Ottoman Empire and for the country to be ruled by an Egypt itself, a true Egyptian independence. In doing so, Ali had implemented a national revenue stream, something that would nationalize the country as a whole. He would go on to raise funds for his own military, which would become Egypt's defense. It worked. With the growing military behind him, Ali began reforming the country. The next step was to create a revenue to compete with European trade. In this, Ali would say that Egyptian textile was the immediate financial forefront. Railroads, water conductors, and also technical schools were being built. Egypt would soon begin to born itself as an independent entity which would compete with the high-ruling Eurocentric industries within 50 years' time, according to Ali. By 1830, he implemented judicial law and order independent of a religious format in which the scholars saw as Sharia. With Ali's sudden death in 1848, Egypt had reformed to new heights. But as history seems to repeat itself, it was short-lived. By June of 1882, Egypt was in the hands of nationalists, opposed to European domination of the country. This seemingly haunting ghost of class warfare visited the country once again. France and Great Britain would resist the nationalists in Egypt, and by August, Great Britain had control over the country, ousting the Egyptian army under Lord Coroner, Britain's chief representative in Egypt at the time, who also viewed Egypt's financial reforms as part of a long-term objective for the embattled country. By 1906, the British had once again confronted a new internal conflict, this time from the Egyptian residents of a village from Deshawi, which was called the Seat of Martyrs. Due to the harsh response by the British military, they feared a new reprisal of Egyptian nationalists. By 1919, Egypt was ripe for a revolt. Mass demonstrations began in and around Egypt. Thus began the Egyptian Revolution, and during this revolution, a young boy was introduced to his first glimpse into Egyptian politics. He would in short order create the country's first modern Islamist organization. His name was Hassan al-Banna. This period would also birth a future Egyptian modernist, Gamel Abdel Nasser. Two people who transformed Egypt forever in just 25 years. British Imperial Governor Lord Edmund Henry Allenby declared Egyptian independence on February 28, 1922. The growing and rapid increase of British colonial rule was too much to deter and was too much of a cost militarily. Meanwhile, al-Banna began hearing of the abolition of the Ottoman Empire. And by this time, another Egyptian innovator would travel and live in Cairo. His name was Said Qutb. By 1928, Qutb would begin his career as a teacher in the Ministry of Public Instruction, and also would author his first of few books. Both al-Banna and Qutb saw the ruling Egyptian elite ignoring the ulema of Islamic culture. They demanded to be properly represented in government and in universities, but they had no power to authorize their demands. But by the fall of the same year, growing demands of the working and religious class, al-Banna created the first organization which would cater to the lower class. It was called the Ikhwan al-Muslimeen, the Muslim Brotherhood. The country had many small Islamic groups at the time, so the Brotherhood began to start farming out into local mosques and universities. By the time the Brotherhood began to birth its formal members, young Nasser, along with his father, moved to Cairo in the same time period. Here, Nasser would be introduced to Egypt's class divisions, and he had his own discontent with those born into wealth and power, which grew throughout his lifetime, as his family were not from Egypt's elite ruling class and saw his structure as divisive. Thus, in the spring of 1937, Nasser applied to the Royal Military Academy. Al-Banna's Brotherhood had begun to transcend outside of Egypt, and it has started from historians that about 500,000 members would make up the Brotherhood itself. Al-Banna would begin to exert his influence to young Muslims from foreign countries, usually motivating them to not be fearful of secular ideologies. He would say, "We need spirited, energetic, and strong young people whose hearts are filled with life, enthusiasm, zeal, and dynamics, whose souls are filled with ambition, aspiration, and vigor, and have great goals, rising and aspiring to reach them until they eventually arrive at their destination." It was just 5 years old, but the Young Egypt Party, headed by Ahmed Hussein, wanted to cater to Egypt's nationalism, but simultaneously adhering to religious elements as well. By 1940, they would become more fervent toward the religious structure of the growing anti-British rule. It would be renamed the Nationalist Islamic Party. And after World War II ended, they would rename it again, this time to the Socialist Party of Egypt. With the growing populace of secular socialist ideologies, al-Banna saw the threat imposed by socialism and secularism from British colonialism. Muslims are compelled to humble themselves before non-Muslims and are ruled by unbelievers. Their lands have been trampled over and their honor besmirched. Their adversaries are in charge of their affairs, and the rights of their religion have fallen into abeyance with their own domains. Hence, it has become an individual obligation which there is no evading on every Muslim to prepare his equipment, to make up his mind to engage in jihad, and to get ready for it until the opportunity is ripe and God decrees. By 1948, however, a new event which would begin the transformation of Islamic culture would begin, this time with the implementation of the State of Israel by British rule. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 saw the first call to the Muslim Ummah of the 20th century. The United Nations partition plan for Palestine was beset by a civil war which suspended the plan. This was the first time Gamel Nasser saw military conflict and was in Palestine for the war. Meanwhile, King Farouk sent the Egyptian army into Israel, as Nasser would serve as staff officer for the 6th Infantry Battalion. At around the same time, Sayyid Qutb would visit the United States and enroll in its universities, spending several months at Colorado State College of Education. Qutb, however, was beset by depression and saw the United States as completely opposed to Islamic law, a nation afflicted with lawlessness and greed. He was appalled by what he perceived as loose sexual openness of American men and women. This American experience was for him a fine-tuning of his Islamic identity, in which he suppressed. While the Arab-Israeli War began its first weeks into the conflict, Egypt was also at odds with the Muslim Brotherhood, this time from Egypt's monarchy. Rumors had begun to take hold in the country streets that the Brotherhood was trying to assassinate its Prime Minister, Mahmoud al-Nokrashi Pasha, and conduct a coup against the government. Al-Banna, ever the pragmatist, tried to conduct meetings with members of the Egyptian government. But on February 12, 1949, Al-Banna and his brother-in-law, Abdul Karim Mansour, were traveling to meet with Mahmoud al-Nokrashi Pasha at the Jama'ir al-Shuban al-Muslimeen headquarters in Cairo. As both men waited by the corner in which they resided, they hailed a taxi. Multiple gunmen descended upon the pair as they entered. Numerous shots were fired. Both were killed. Immediately, the Brotherhood accused King Farouk and the Egyptian Iron Guard as responsible for the assassination. The effect of al-Banna's death resonated throughout the Arab world, even into the nationalist sectors. Nasser tried to reach out to the Brotherhood to form an alliance, but noticing the organizational religious structure as becoming too untenable with Nasser's own nationalist ideology, he decided against this. After the Arab-Israeli conflict had ended, Nasser would continue to instruct at the Royal Military Academy. By 1951, Qutb would return to Egypt from the United States. His experiences there would transform him into a more fervent Islamic instructor. He saw the West as inferior and absent of God, needing a religious structure in which he saw a threat to Arab unity in the Middle East. The American is primitive in his artistic taste, both in what he enjoys as art and in his own artistic works. Jazz music is his music of choice. This is that music that the Negroes invented to satisfy their primitive inclinations, as well as their desire to be noisy on the one hand and to excite bestial tendencies on the other. The American's intoxication in jazz music does not reach its full completion until the music is accompanied by singing that is just as coarse and obnoxious as the music itself. Meanwhile, the noise of the instruments, when the voices, mounts, and it rings in the ears to an unbearable degree. The agitation of the multitude increases, and the voices of approval mount, and their psalms ring out in vehement, continuous applause that all but deafens the ears. Qutb began his direct affiliation with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. He regarded the death of al-Banna and immediately called the founder of the Brotherhood a martyr against the threat of Arab nationalism. Qutb feared the influence of the West beginning to take hold, not just in Egypt, but throughout the Arab East as a whole. Egypt would once again witness another class warfare by 1952. The Free Officers Movement of Egypt began a military coup of the Egyptian government, forcing the ouster of King Farouk. The conflict initially started as a small rebellion, a military cell under Abdel Munim Abdul Rauf, which were, of course, headed under also Gamel Abdel Nasser, Hussein Hamouda, Khalad Mohiddin, Kamal el-Din Hussein, Salah Nasser, Abdul Hakim Amir, and Saeed Tawfiq. The new leadership witnessed Mohammed Naguib as the official figurehead. However, this was short-lived. Nasser had the backing of the rebellion, and suddenly it became a full-on war revolution of the country. Nasser eventually upended Naguib and became the de facto leader after deposing Naguib in the end. The Muslim Brotherhood, however, were the ones behind Naguib and tried to force religious authority over the residents of Cairo, to which Nasser immediately rebuffed them. Almost upon his ascension to being president, Nasser cracked down on the Brotherhood, arresting and deposing many in the harsh Egyptian prison cells at Tor prison. By 1954, Nasser had implemented a separate organization which was called the Tahrir, which would oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Banna's brother-in-law, Sayyid Ramadan, would be the de facto leader of the Brotherhood at the time, while Sayyid Qutb as its influential religious authority. Nasser held closed-door meetings with both men, assuring them falsely that the Egyptian government would allow the Brotherhood to remain free to conduct their activities without imposition. However, in short time, Qutb found out about Nasser's actual plans for the Brotherhood and conducted plans to conduct a coup against the Nasser government. Quickly, Nasser responded by the mass arrest, mostly of the hierarchy of the Brotherhood, as well as Sayyid Qutb. The continuing class warfare of the ruling nationalist government in the next 2 years against the religious authorities of Egypt were rampant. Qutb was tortured, like so many of the Brotherhood and other religious adherents. He saw early release after pressure from Prime Minister of Iraq, Abdul Salam Arif, who saw Qutb's imprisonment as unjust. However, in just a few short months, Qutb was arrested once again, this time charged with plotting to overthrow the state. Qutb's trial was a farce to many who attended, and however, he was unfazed by the death sentence for which he knew his death would be reverberated throughout the Islamic world. On the morning of August 19, 1966, Qutb, along with 2 members of the Brotherhood, were executed by hanging. Upon the immediate news of his execution, the Islamists throughout the Levant were impacted. They saw Qutb as a true martyr. Nasser witnessed a new Islamic revolution in which the Islamic Authority saw secular pan-nationalism as a direct threat to its existence. So did Great Britain. The British, along with the United States, wanted to open pan-Arab nationalism and upend it. The influence purported by Gamel Nasser, who they saw as a threat. They began implementing goals to slowly upend Nasser's ideology. Qutb's early prison writings were influential with the growth of Islamism. One such book, Millstones, warned of the threat of the Arab world under secularism. Democracy in the West has become infertile to such an extent that it is borrowing from the systems of the Eastern Bloc, especially in the economic system under the name of socialism. It is the same with the Eastern Bloc. Its social theories, foremost among which is Marxism, in the beginning attracted not only a large number of people from the East, but also from the West, as it was a way of life based on a creed. But now Marxism is defeated on the plane of thought, and if it is stated that not a single nation in the world is truly Marxist, it will not be an exaggeration. On the whole, this theory conflicts with man's nature and its needs. This ideology prospers only in a degenerate society or in a society which has become cowed as a result of some form of prolonged dictatorship. But now, even under these circumstances, its materialistic economic system is failing, although this was the only foundation on which the structure was based. Russia, which is the leader of the communist countries, is itself suffering from shortages of food. Although during the times of the Tsar's Russia used to produce surplus food, it now has to import food from abroad and has to sell its reserves of gold for this purpose. The main reason for this is the failure of the system of collective farming, or one can say the failure of a system which is against human nature. From his works, Qutbism began to influence many young Islamists of the future. One of them was a young student of Egypt's medical system, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Al-Zawahiri saw Qutb's death as a profound act from an existential threat to the Islamic Ummah as a whole. Another Islamic student of law, Omar Abdul Rahman, a blind sheikh from Cairo, also began preaching against the government under Gamel Nasser throughout the late 1960s. Rahman had become a muezzin, one who has completely memorized the Quran. He began and implemented the muezzin at the age of 11, a remarkable feat considering he was blind and used a Quran which was in Braille. Egypt would once again feature a new internal reclassification, as history would reintroduce a new revolution in short order. Gamel Nasser had succumbed to a heart attack on September 28, 1970, leaving his vice president, Anwar Sadat, to become the country's new president. Under his new ascension to the throne, Sadat wanted to become a more liberal-minded leader toward the growing influence of Egypt's Islamic ruling class. He relaxed the strict governance toward the Muslim Brotherhood and towards Egypt's religious institutions. This would prove to be a fatal mistake later on, however. In a move that would define the new beginning of the Islamic Revolution and begin a force that would exist to the present day, Sadat conducted a surprise attack against the Israeli forces occupying the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights on October 6, 1973. The attack would be historically known as the Yom Kippur War. And just 6 years prior to the Six-Day War, which saw a failure of 5 combined Arab nations against the Israeli military backed by the United States, the Israeli army, led by General Ariel Sharon, would later become Israeli prime minister, had crossed onto the Suez Canal. The United States did not want to witness a second war of failure by the Arabs and enacted Resolution 338, which proposed a ceasefire led by the United States and the Soviet Union. The war, however, boosted morale throughout the Arab world. The Islamist uprising saw Sadat as fully detached from the early ideology promoted by Nasser. However, Sadat's next move began his downfall. On January 18, 1974, Sadat negotiated a peace deal with Israel. This had never happened in the history of the Arab world. Egyptian groups like the Brotherhood, whom transformed into a more political ideology, were not fond of the idea, but didn't oppose. However, Egypt's more radical Islamist groups, like the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Gamma Islamiyah, saw this as an affront to Islam as a whole. On November 19, 1977, Sadat became the first Arab leader to visit Israel. And finally, on March 26, 1979, with the influence of U.S. President Jimmy Carter, the Camp David Accords, signed by Egypt's President Anwar Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin in Washington, D.C., were finalized. It was a truly unprecedented move. The key points of the Constitution were as follows in regards to the West Bank and Gaza. Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the representatives of the Palestinian people should participate in negotiations on the resolution of the Palestinian problem in all its aspects. Egypt and Israel agree that in order to ensue a peaceful and orderly transfer of authority and taking into account the security concerns of all the parties, there should be transitional agreements for the West Bank and Gaza for a period not exceeding 5 years. In order to provide full autonomy to the inhabitants under these arrangements, the Israeli military government and its civilian administration will be withdrawn as soon as a self-governing authority has been freely elected by the inhabitants of these areas to replace the existing military government. Egypt, Israel, and Jordan will agree on the modalities for establishing electing self-governing authorities in the West Bank and Gaza. The delegations of Egypt and Jordan may include Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza or other Palestinians as mutually agreed. The parties will negotiate an agreement which will define the powers and responsibilities of the self-governing authority to be exercised in the West Bank and Gaza. A withdrawal of Israeli armed forces will take place, and there will be a redeployment of the remaining Israeli forces into specified security locations. The agreement will also include arrangements for assuring internal and external security and public order. A strong local police force will be established, which may include Jordanian citizens. In addition, Israeli and Jordanian forces will participate in joint patrols and in the manning of control posts to assure the security of the borders. The Islamic sects of Egypt immediately began implementing a government coup that saw Sadat's recent political agendas that were against the unity of the religious authority. Members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, headed by Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj, began recruiting Egyptian military officers into the plot. They would include Aboud el-Zamar, the Egyptian colonel of the Egyptian military intelligence, and Khalid al-Islambouli, the first lieutenant of the 17th Artillery Regiment, and began implementing a plan for the assassination of Anwar Sadat. Both men were also members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Members of the groups Majid el-Shura, with the consultative council led by the blind Sheikh Abdul Rahman, were the primary influences of the plot. However, while al-Zawahiri was behind the scenes and had no major part, he was also an influence. On October 6th, 1981, Sadat is seated just 3 rows behind the military facade where a victory parade was held in Cairo to commemorate the 8th anniversary of Egypt's crossing into the Suez Canal. Sadat was surrounded by layers of his security detail. When the Egyptian Air Force Mirage jets flew overhead, members of the Egyptian military began to follow each other out of an army truck parked just a mere 50 feet away from the facade where Sadat was seated. One truck contained the assassination squad led by Lieutenant Khalid Islambouli. They immediately began firing into the facade, and Sadat's nephew, Talat el-Sadat, later would go on to say, "The president thought the killers were part of the show when they approached the stand firing, so he stood saluting them." Sadat was hit in the first volley, and members seated as the facade began throwing their chairs at the assailants. Sadat and 10 others were killed outright or suffered fatal wounds, which included Major General Hassan Alam, Khalfan Nasser Mohammed, and Samir Helmi Ibrahim. Injured in the assassination was Vice President Hosni Mubarak. Mohammed ibn al-Faraj gave his reason for the assassination during the trial. The basis of the existence of imperialism in the lands of Islam is these self-same rulers. To begin with, the struggle against imperialism is a work which is neither glorious nor useful. It is only a waste of time. It is our duty to concentrate on our Islamic cause, and that is the establishment, first of all, of God's law in our country and causing the world of God to prevail. There is no doubt that the first battlefield of the jihad is the extirpation of the infidel leaderships and their replacement by a perfect Islamic order, and from this will come the release of our energies. However, before the trial had started, Egyptian authorities investigating the murder of Sadat came across a profound document. During a search of Faraj's residence, they came across a manuscript entitled Al-Farida al-Gahib, the neglected duty. The manuscript would outline the agenda of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and future Islamic groups that would carry across decades to the current age. Muslim blood will be shed in order to realize this victory over Israel. Now it must be asked whether this victory will benefit the interest of infidel rule. It will mean the strengthening of a state which rebels against the laws of God, the Sharia. These rulers will take advantage of the nationalist ideas of these Muslims in order to realize their un-Islamic aims, even though at the surface these aims look Islamic. Fighting has to be done only under the banner of Islam and under Islamic leadership. The assassination began a new revolution with the Islamist generations. The ideology of Arab nationalism was now long dead. A new movement had begun, Pan-Islamism, an ideology influenced by the tautology of Ibn Taymiyyah, the Islamic scholar of the 12th century, and the ideology of Ibn Hanbal, the Islamic scholar of the 9th century, as well as the early works of Sayyid Qutb, had begun to transform not just Egypt, but to Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, even Afghanistan. After the Soviets had invaded, it had given momentum, and the rise of the defensive jihad purported by a Palestinian imam, Abdullah Yusuf Azam. Soon, other Islamist groups would start operating throughout the Arab world that would continue to the present day. At the current moment, many of the Islamist organizations seem to be heavily motivated by U.S.-Israeli foreign policy, and there seems to be no end to the Islamists' ideological direction, even under the assault of drone strikes of countries that were once made prosperous under Pan Arabism by U.S. coalition forces. The Tawheed of the Islamic community continues to battle two fronts. One from the extremist perspective, who sees only the jihadist worldview, and those from the foreign policy perspective of the United States and Israel, of interjecting into Arab politics. The end result is yet to be seen. But the future of the Arab world is currently under the direct threats of endless foreign-led destabilization and internal sectarianism. The jihad continues.